Welcome back. We're going to talk about infrastructure. Infrastructure is a really big word for the built environment. Many of you may be familiar with this. Some of you it might be a new concept. Infrastructure can be as simple as paint on the road or as magnificent as a pedestrian overcrossing, or grander, of course. We're going to talk a little bit about lack of infrastructure, which is more commonly seen in a lot of areas than really the fancy infrastructure, but we'll have examples of all different forms. Before we dive into that, a brief history of traffic engineering. The gist of what we're looking at here is what we started with was a system that was really defined by people, not in vehicles. So people on horses and people walking. When we laid out our uses and our services in our cities, we designed around people that would be walking. It advanced and the means of transportation increased with adding bicycles and adding transit, but that continued to be the dominant source of transportation until we get into the 1950s, where the automobile came around. And over time, we started designing our networks around the automobile. And we left behind the connectivity for people on bikes, people walking, and buses. And there's a lot of layers that went into how we pushed into favoring those that could have cars and away from people that did not. And this created a difficult situation for vulnerable users, forcing them to have a very disconnected traffic network or transportation network, and forcing the vulnerable users to share some of these resources that are designed for automobiles and putting them at a higher risk. So just to be aware and take into our attention that we started with the horses and the people walking, and they have every right to be using the network as much as people that are driving. And it's your responsibility as a friendly driver to acknowledge that these other users exist, and we need to be safe when we're driving with them. So I mentioned infrastructure can be beautiful and grand and clean, but there's also the reality that there's lots of places where it's not quite that apparent. So in this picture here, what we're looking at is a very wide street with no paints, no marking, and it's very difficult to define as a person driving the position and where one would need to be. It's also very unclear where the person, a vulnerable user, a person on a bike or a person walking, would cross or would position themselves in this roadway. It's very disconnected for specifically a person that would be walking. And then we have a few examples over on that right-hand side of where we don't have an existing bike lane at all. There's just a gravel shoulder. And on the bottom right, there used to be clear painting of a person on a bike indicating a bike lane, but that is hence worn off, and this is very common. And so as a friendly driver, you need to be able to notice where there might be these vulnerable users, even if it's not clearly defined by a perfect paint job. In the middle photo, what we do have is a place for people walking to cross the street, but there's nowhere for them to go once they do cross. That network isn't complete, and this puts the person walking in a really vulnerable position as they're trying to navigate through these areas. So we're going to talk about infrastructure for people walking. In the state of Oregon, every corner is a crosswalk. So even in this photo here where we kind of have swervy streets, every single corner there's the potential for a person walking to be crossing. And what the law actually says is that a person that has the intention to cross would need to place a wheel, a cane, a toe, or something in that intersection in order to indicate clearly that they would like to cross, and then you are required to stop. But as a friendly driver, what we're really asking for you to do is be a little bit more observant than that. And it's really easy to kind of make eye contact or just look and notice when there are people, when you're approaching intersection, any intersection, there could be someone crossing, to see that, to make some kind of connection and stop to allow the person that is walking access to crossing the road. In the graphic on the right-hand side, what we're looking at is a person on a bike and a person driving stopping at an intersection so that this person walking can cross. The person on the bike is required to abide by the same exact rules as that person that is driving and must stop for the person who desires to cross. This is an example of a huge intersection that potentially could have people crossing. If you look up and down the street, there's really nowhere else for a person to cross. And if they live in the neighborhood on this side and they'd like to get to the Shell station and grab a bag of chips, they're going to want to cross at one of these really wide places. So as a friendly driver, it's important for you to pay attention to every time you come to an intersection and anticipate that there could be people walking and that you'll need to respond by stopping and allowing them to have that access. There's also very nice crosswalks in some areas, and this is showing the white markings that would indicate a crosswalk. It is the responsibility as a friendly driver to stop prior to the white markings and allow for the person that is walking to cross. Also, as you see in the graphic on the right-hand side, the person on the bike is required to stop just like the person driving. And then another piece about being a friendly driver is you really want to look both ways to make sure that there's no one, that if there's going to be people walking from either side. This is an example of showing the 3 different types of crosswalks that you may see. It's realistic that you could see these 3 different types in a block, within one block. So what we have on the left side is a very clearly marked crosswalk. There's mid-block crosswalks, and we have unmarked crosswalks. And in some cases, you might see a mix of this. So you may see if you imagine the unmarked crosswalk on that right-hand side having maybe possibly 2 sides that are marked, but then the north-south route is not marked, that is still a crosswalk. Even though it's not clearly marked, it works as an unmarked crosswalk. So as a friendly driver, it's good to pay attention as you're approaching an intersection for other vulnerable users that may be trying to cross in these locations. This is an example of what is called a mid-block crossing, and rapid flashing beacons are this great technology that help for safe crossings. When you're approaching a rapid flashing beacon and you see the lights, you can see them from quite a distance. As a person driving and as a friendly driver, you'll stop before the white line and allow for the people crossing to cross. As a friendly driver, it's recommended you allow the people to cross all the way. The law states once they make it to the center island, you can safely proceed, but it is always most appropriate to really feel out what's the best thing to do, and the most friendly thing is really to let them make it safely across. Note here that sometimes people that are using this type of infrastructure don't know that you need to push the button to light it up to indicate to the person driving that they intend to cross. They could just enter. So as a friendly driver, notice if there's a person waiting to cross or entering that crosswalk, and always make sure you respond, because you don't want to smush a person that's crossing just because they didn't turn the light on. This is another really key thing about using a crosswalk. As the law says, you are not allowed to pass another driver if they are stopped at a crosswalk. You cannot see what's right in front of them, and if there's a person walking and you go around them, then you're very likely will end up crashing with the person and smushing that person. And just to re-highlight this idea that these are people, these are brothers, these are sisters, these are mothers, these are cousins, these are best friends. We don't want to smash any of these people. So these are really important values for you to have when you're on the road. This particular rule is really essential when you're behind a bus, whether it's transit or a school bus, because the visibility is so limited. You never want to pass a stopped bus at a crosswalk. And also because the users of buses tend to be people walking that could be exiting off. you need to make sure that you give enough time and allow for all of those people walking to clear. So I want you to take a look at this graphic, and I'm going to call your attention to the person driving that is stopped at the stop sign in the bottom lane. And notice this person is completely stopped, as is the person on the bike, and there is a pedestrian crossing. I want you to think about for a moment if the person driving is acting as a friendly driver. So if your thoughts went to no, you're right. So little innuendos here, but the person driving is in the crosswalk. So imagine that person walking and how they have to travel to get around that car. They're gonna have to enter into the intersection, and that puts the person walking at a really high risk of being smashed. So as a friendly driver, you wanna always stop before the crosswalk and allow for enough space for the people walking to cross. You may creep into that crosswalk after you have stopped to make sure it's safe to take a right-hand turn or cross, but your initial stop will always be before that crosswalk at the white line, allowing for people that are walking to fully cross before you do go and check. We're going to dive into infrastructure for people biking. So we saw kind of a faded, more realistic bike lane. This is a really lovely, clearly painted bike lane. These exist on roads that are wide enough for there to be a person on a bike and a person driving in the lane. One thing to be aware of with bike lanes is there are times when, as a person driving, you need to cross them. And as a friendly driver, you're responsible for making sure there are no people on bikes in those bike lanes when you do need to do this. So for example, what we see in the graphic on the right-hand side is a person driving is backing out of a bike lane, and there's a person on a bike. As a friendly driver, you would wait till the person on the bike clears the driveway, and then you may back out of your parking or your driveway. Another example is with the white car, the person driving the white car turning left into a driveway. There is a person on a bike that's going the right direction in the bike lane. As a friendly driver, you would wait till that person on the bike clears that driveway, makes it down the road, and then you can safely turn. Here's another example of a bike lane. And what we're looking at in this picture is how bike lanes often interact with the lanes that are designed for vehicles. And there are times when a person driving can cross a bike lane. In the graphic on the right is similar to what we see in the picture. The person driving is crossing the bike lane to get into a turn lane. The person driving cannot use a bike lane as a turn lane, but can cross it to get into a turn lane or to turn. Across it. In the graphic on the right-hand side, what we see is all the potential crashes that can occur in a setup like this with this type of infrastructure. So as a friendly driver, it is your responsibility to always check the bike lane if you're going to be crossing it, making sure it's completely clear of any people on bikes. When you're taking a right-hand turn, you're going to be looking at a bike lane you may be crossing over, and in this graphic on the right, you also need to be paying attention to whether or not there is a person on a bike going west to eastbound, so that you don't turn into the bike lane. You want to give plenty of time for the person on the bike to clear the intersection before you take your turn. Oh, buffered bike lanes. These are designed to make a person on a bike feel a little bit more safe and comfortable. It's a little bit more space so they don't get squeezed. These can be crossed over if you're leaving a parking area. So as you see in the picture, there is a vehicle, a person driving that's pulling out of a parking area, crossing over the buffered bike lane and entering into the lane of traffic. This is fine, and as a friendly driver, your responsibility is to check that bike lane and make sure it's totally clear and there's no people biking in it, and then you can cross it safely. The graphic on the right illustrates a buffered bike lane that is going along, and there are multiple driveways. So as a person driving would be pulling out of a driveway, it needs to make sure it checks to see if there's any people on bike using the buffered bike lane before they pull out, or they're going to smash them. So this graphic is a protected bike lane, and you'll notice, even if you just close your eyes and look at the picture, the first thing your eye tends to be drawn to is the green paint. So the green paint is often used sometimes in more urban areas, so you may not have this in your community, but you might come across it when you're in other communities that might be more dense or more heavily populated. The green paint will help, and like I said, draw your attention. It can slow the traffic slowing color, and it's effective for indicating that there are people on bikes present, and draws attention to that and helps people with their awareness. We're gonna talk a little bit right now about that same technique I talked about a while back called the Dutch reach, because it also applies in this case if you were in the passenger seat and you were going to open the door. So if you're in the passenger seat, you're going to find your left hand and you're going to reach over for that door and open the door there. Notice your view shed expands over your right shoulder. That allows you to see if there's anybody coming, wheeling, rolling by in that protected bike lane. So that is emphasized here in the graphic on the right-hand side. What we're looking at is there's a person parked adjacent to a protected bike lane. If they were to open their door while this person on the bike was cruising by, that person would get doored and go flying. And it's better if they check, delay opening the door, let the person on the bike go by, and then they can exit their car safely. So what we're looking at in this graphic is a personal vehicle that is parked in the bike lane. Do you think this is a friendly move or not friendly move? I'm going to give you 2 seconds just to think about it and think about, as a friendly driver, what would be the right thing. If you thought not friendly, you are correct. In the state of Oregon, you are not allowed to park in the bike lane, say to run in, grab a cup of coffee, get a latte, if it's your personal vehicle. If required to park in a bike lane by your work duties, to work on a utility pole or make a delivery, that is allowed. That is an exception, but you can't park there just because you want to hop in, drop off your library books. Like, that's really there for the bikers to get around, or the people biking to get around. Sharrows are a really great feature that sometimes are not known by all. You might see this infrastructure on the roadway and be like, oh, I don't know what that means. Or maybe you're really familiar with it. But a sharrow is in an area, it's a shared narrow roadway. So a roadway that is too narrow to have a lane and a bike lane. They've brought them together and allow for the people on bikes and people driving to share this. This is done in areas where speeds are also slow. And you can see on the right-hand side in the graphic that sometimes if you're a person driving and you're not aware of the function of this infrastructure and a person on a bike enters into the roadway, you might be caught off guard. And depending on your speeds, there could be a crash in this kind of a situation. So as a friendly driver, you want to recognize when you're on a sharrow and you want to know what to expect. These are really great with moving traffic along. They're really great with wayfinding, and so they're fantastic transportation tools, and especially if we know how to use them. So take a look at this picture, and we've got 2 people on bikes in that one lane in the sharrow, and then we have a person driving. And just out of curiosity, your thoughts on whether or not this is okay, whether the proximity of the vehicle, the person driving, and the people on bikes are in the good. If you said yes, you're correct. So it is okay for 2 bikes to be next to each other, and then for the person driving to be behind, following at that kind of closeness, because these are slower speeds, and it is okay as long as those 2 people on the bikes are not obstructing traffic and going with the flow of traffic, this is okay and commonly seen. All right, we're going to dive into roundabouts. These are really, really great pieces of traffic engineering or infrastructure. You may not have them where you regularly drive, but they do exist in a lot of areas, and you might find yourself traveling to a place where there's lots of roundabouts, and it's really helpful to know how to engage in them. The good things about roundabouts is how well they reduce crashes. In a normal intersection, there's 32 different ways where you can get into a crash. In a roundabout, there's only 4. The vulnerable users, especially people walking, tend to interact with traffic in a whole different way than people driving. And there are there are a couple options for how a person on a bike can use a roundabout. So we'll talk about that for a moment. A person on a bike can use a roundabout 2 different ways. One, they could enter just as a person driving would, and just as a person driving would not pass another person driving in a roundabout, you would never pass a person on a bike in a roundabout. You treat them as if they're a person driving, let them make their way through. They signal when they're ready to leave the intersection, and then you'll be able to move on and through that intersection. As a friendly driver, it is also your responsibility to signal when you're exiting a roundabout. The second way that a person on a bike can make their way through this roundabout is they could use the crosswalks and the sidewalks as a person walking. The speed is about 3 miles per hour, and they're required to, they can stay on their bike, they just need to go the speed of people walking. As a friendly driver, it's your responsibility to slow down when you are coming up to crosswalk, especially if there are any vulnerable users present, and to understand how these pieces of infrastructure work. Here's another piece of bike infrastructure that you may or may not see. Tends to be in more urban environments, but again, you'll notice the green paint. It is a big flag to say there's bikers present, there are other users out here, slow down. And what the bike box does is it clusters people on bikes in the front, and it has a person driving. They must stop at where it's very clearly indicated with wait here, but at the white line behind the green box. It moves bikes through an intersection faster and safer, and it helps to reduce confusion at intersections when people are not familiar with how maybe a person on a bike might be making their way through the intersection. As a friendly driver, you do not enter the bike box. You stay behind it. You also cannot turn right on a red light. You have to wait for the light to turn green. You can't cross over the bike box. You might run into a person on a bike. Cross bikes, another tool that helps to let everyone know that there's people on bikes that might be present. Green paint, once again, traffic slowing. The person on the bike is still required to follow the rules of the road, just as the person driving when they're on these cross bikes. The minute that person on the bike moves into the crosswalk, the white paint you see in the picture, and then they are considered people walking. And as a person driving, you need to respond to them as if they're people walking and give them that right of way as they're crossing an intersection.